Part 1. The Land Before Names. Hook. Imagine a place so quiet that the only sound you hear is the wind moving through endless trees. No cities, no roads, no borders. Just land stretching farther than the eye can see. Before it was ever called America, before history books gave it chapters and dates, this land already had a story. A slow one, a calm one, a human one. Long before ships crossed the ocean, this land was home. Not empty, never empty. Forests covered much of the east, dense and alive. Rivers flowed without interruption, carving their paths over centuries. In the center, vast plains stretched beneath open skies. To the west, mountains stood still, as they always had. And across this land lived many different Native American tribes. Each one had its own way of life. Some moved with the seasons, following herds and weather patterns. Others built permanent homes, growing crops and forming villages that lasted generations. There was no single way to live, only what worked in harmony with the land. Mornings began with light, not alarms. The sun rose slowly, and people rose with it. Fires were rekindled, food was prepared. The day unfolded naturally. There was work, of course, there always is. Hunting, gathering, building, teaching. But there was also stillness, moments where nothing needed to be rushed. Children learned by watching. Elders shared stories not from books, but from memory. These stories carried meaning, not just about the past, but about how to live. Time itself felt different. It wasn't measured in minutes or hours, but in cycles. The return of birds, the melting of snow, the ripening of crops. Life followed patterns, not schedules. And in those patterns, there was balance. At night, the world became quieter still. Fires glowed softly. The sky filled with stars, clear, bright, uninterrupted by artificial light. People gathered close. Stories were told, not just for entertainment, but for connection. Stories about the land, about ancestors, about lessons learned long ago. And as those stories were spoken, they became part of something larger, a shared memory that moved through generations. There were challenges, of course. Nature is never completely gentle. Winters could be harsh, food could become scarce, conflicts between tribes sometimes arose. But even in difficulty, life moved forward, not in sudden leaps, but in steady steps. And then, slowly, almost invisibly at first, something began to change. Far beyond the horizon, across an ocean no one here had seen, other people were moving, preparing, searching for something new. They didn't know exactly where they would arrive, they didn't know who they would meet, but their journey had already begun. And soon, the quiet rhythm of this land would be interrupted. Not all at once, not loudly, but in a way that would change everything. Part 2. The First Ships and Silent Shores. Far out on the ocean, where the water seems endless and the sky feels too large, small wooden ships moved slowly forward. The journey was long, longer than most had ever known. Weeks turned into months, the days blurred together, waves, wind, and uncertainty. There was no clear path, only direction, no guarantee, only hope. On board, life was cramped and quiet. People spoke in low voices, some prayed, some stared endlessly at the horizon, wondering what waited for them. They were leaving behind something familiar, but moving toward something unknown. And then, One day, land appeared. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a thin line in the distance, dark against the pale sky. For a moment, no one spoke. After so much emptiness, even the sight of land felt unreal. As the ships came closer, details slowly emerged. Tall trees, unbroken shoreline, a place untouched by anything they had known before. To them, it felt new, but it wasn't. On the shore, life was already there. Native communities had seen signs, unfamiliar shapes far out at sea, something different, something approaching. There was no way to know what it meant, only that change was coming. The first steps onto land were careful. Feet touched the ground slowly, almost uncertainly. After months at sea, the earth felt steady, but unfamiliar. The air smelled different, fresher, wilder. There were no buildings, no roads, no signs of the world they had left behind, only nature, stretching in every direction. At first, survival was the only focus. Shelter had to be built, food had to be found, water had to be secured. There was no time for long thoughts about the future, only the present, day by day. The settlers worked hard, but the land was not easy. Winters came colder than expected. Crops didn't always grow as planned. Hunger became a quiet, constant presence. Some nights were filled with doubt. Had they made the right choice? Would they survive? But yet they continued, because going back was no longer an option. In those early days, something important happened, something often overlooked. Moments of connection, not always perfect, not always easy, but real. There were times when native tribes shared knowledge, how to grow certain crops, how to understand the land, how to survive in a place that followed different rules. These moments were quiet, no grand speeches, no written agreements, just people helping people in small but meaningful ways. But alongside those moments, there was also misunderstanding. Different languages, different beliefs, different ways of living. What one group saw as normal, the other might not understand, and slowly those differences began to grow. The settlements expanded, more ships arrived, more people stepped onto the shore, more space was needed. Forests were cleared, land was claimed. What had once been shared began to feel divided. Still, in the middle of it all, daily life continued. Mornings came, work was done, evenings brought brief rest. There were small moments of peace, watching the sun set over unfamiliar land, hearing the wind move through trees that had stood there long before. But beneath that quiet surface, something deeper was building, a slow tension, not yet fully visible, not yet fully understood, but growing. Because this wasn't just the meeting of two groups of people, it was the meeting of two completely different worlds, and neither one would remain unchanged. Part 3. Small Settlements, Big Dreams. The shoreline was no longer silent. Where there had once been only trees and wind, there were now small signs of human presence. Rough wooden homes, faint trails in the dirt, smoke rising gently into the sky. The settlements were still small, but they were growing. Each day began the same way, quietly. The first light of morning slipped through the trees. One by one, people stepped outside their homes, breathing in the cool air. There was always work waiting. Fields needed tending, tools needed repairing, food needed preparing. Life was simple, but never easy. The houses were modest, built by hand, piece by piece, wood gathered from nearby forests, walls shaped without perfection, roofs designed more for survival than comfort. Inside, there was little, but it was enough. a place to rest, a place to gather, a place to feel, even briefly, safe. Communities began to take shape. Neighbors became familiar faces. People learned each other's names, their habits, their struggles. There was no real privacy, not in the way we think of it today. Lives were shared. If someone needed help, others stepped in. If someone fell sick, the community noticed. In a world so uncertain, connection became strength. But even as these small communities grew, something else grew quietly alongside them: an idea. At first, it wasn't spoken loudly. It appeared in conversations, around dinner tables, during long walks, in quiet moments after a day's work. People began to think differently. They were far from the lands they came from, far from kings and governments that once controlled their lives. Here, things felt different, more open, more uncertain, but also more possible. What if they could make their own decisions? What if their lives didn't have to be directed by someone across an ocean? These weren't bold declarations, not yet, just thoughts, small but powerful. As more settlers arrived, the colonies expanded. Different regions began to develop their own identities. Some areas focused on farming, long days in the fields, tied closely to the rhythm of the seasons. Others became centers of trade, ships arriving and leaving, carrying goods, ideas, and stories from distant places. Despite the differences, there was a shared feeling. They were building something, not just homes, but a future. Still, life remained fragile. A poor harvest could change everything. A harsh winter could undo months of effort. Nothing was guaranteed. And perhaps that's what made each small success feel so meaningful. A full meal, a strong shelter, a peaceful night. There were moments of quiet joy, children playing near the edges of the forest, families gathering at the end of the day, laughter carried softly through the evening air. Simple things. But in a world like this, simple things mattered most. And yet, beyond these daily routines, the world was slowly shifting. The connection to the distant ruling power still existed. Rules were still being made from far away. Decisions that affected lives here were often made by people who had never seen this land. At first, it was accepted, then questioned, then quietly resisted. The change didn't come at once. It rarely does. It started with thoughts, then conversations, then something more. Because as these settlements grew stronger, so did the belief that they could stand on their own. But belief alone isn't enough to change history. It needs a moment, a spark, something that turns quiet ideas into action. And that moment was getting closer. Part 4. The Quiet Rise of Resistance. At first, nothing seemed different. The morning still arrived softly. The fields were still tended. The towns continued their steady rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. It didn't start with anger. It started with questions, small ones. Why were decisions being made so far away? Why did rules arrive without explanation? Why did life here feel controlled by people who had never lived it? These questions weren't shouted. They were spoken quietly, between neighbors, over meals, during long evenings when the work was done. In small meeting places, people gathered, not as rebels, not yet, just as individuals trying to understand their place in a changing world. Candles flickered as voices stayed low. Some were cautious. Things have always been this way, they would say. Others weren't so sure. Maybe they don't have to be. The distance between the colonies and their rulers across the ocean began to feel larger than ever, not just in miles, but in understanding. New rules continued to arrive, taxes, restrictions, controls. To some, they seemed reasonable. To others, they felt heavy, not just because of the cost alone, but because of what they represented, a lack of choice. Still, life went on. That's what people do. They adapt, they continue. They find ways to live within the world they are given. But even in adaptation, thoughts were changing. In quiet corners of towns, pamphlets began to appear, words written not just to inform, but to persuade, ideas about freedom, about fairness, about the right to have a voice. These words traveled slowly from hand to hand, read in silence, discussed in whispers. Not everyone agreed. Some believed loyalty was the safer path, that stability mattered more than change. And they had a point. Change brings uncertainty, and uncertainty can be frightening. Others felt something different, a growing sense that life could be more than following distant commands, that maybe, just maybe, they could shape their own future. There were no clear leaders at first, no single voice guiding the way, just many voices slowly aligning. Tension grew, but quietly, not yet in open conflict, but in moments, a disagreement here, a protest there, a decision to resist in small ways, refusing certain goods, speaking out in meetings, choosing not to stay silent. Even in these moments, there was hesitation, because once you begin to question authority, there is no easy way to return to how things were. And still, the days continued. Children played, work was done, evenings brought rest. From the outside, everything looked the same. But inside, everything was changing. This was not a sudden revolution. It was something slower, something deeper, a quiet rise built on thought, conversation, and belief. And like all slow changes, there would come a moment when quiet resistance would no longer remain quiet. Part 5. The moment everything changed. There are moments in history that don't feel important at first. No loud announcement, no clear beginning, just a shift. So subtle, you almost miss it. The tension had been building for years. Quiet conversations, careful resistance, unanswered questions. And then, slowly, those quiet feelings began to take shape. In towns and cities, people gathered more often now, not just to talk, but to decide. What should be done? How far should they go? What were they willing to risk? These were no longer distant thoughts. They were becoming real choices. Still, no one rushed, because everyone understood something important. Once a line is crossed, there is no going back. Then came small acts of defiance, not violent, not chaotic, but meaningful. Refusing to follow certain rules, standing together instead of standing alone. These actions sent a quiet message. We are no longer just listening, we are responding. The response from authority was firm. Rules became stricter, control tightened, and with that, the space for compromise began to disappear. In the middle of all this, ordinary life continued. People still woke up early, still worked, still cared for their families, but there was a new feeling in the air, a sense of waiting, as if everyone knew something bigger was coming. And then it did. Not as a single event, but as a series of moments that could no longer be ignored. Tensions turned to confrontation, words turned to action, and suddenly what had once been quiet disagreement became open conflict. But even then, it wasn't loud everywhere. In many places, it felt strangely still. People waiting, watching, listening for news, not sure what tomorrow would bring. For some, there was fear, because conflict always carries uncertainty. Homes could be lost, families could be separated, the future could change in ways no one could control. For others, there was determination, a belief that this moment, no matter how difficult, was necessary, that something important was at stake. Not just land, not just rules, but the idea of choosing one's own path. In quiet rooms, decisions were made, not perfectly, not easily, but with intention. And as those decisions spread, the colonies moved closer to something they had never fully imagined before. Not just resistance, not just protest, but independence. Still, nothing was guaranteed. The path ahead was uncertain, the outcome unclear. But one thing had changed forever. The silence was gone. What had once been quiet thoughts had become a shared movement. And now there was no turning back. Part 7. Writing the Rules of a New World. After the decision to become a nation came a quieter, more complicated question. How should it work? Freedom had been declared, but freedom alone is not a system. It needs structure, balance, understanding. In meeting rooms filled with long tables and tired minds, leaders gathered once again, not to fight this time, but to figure things out. The conversations were not easy. Different people had different ideas. Some believed in stronger central control, something stable, something firm. Others feared that too much control would bring them back to where they started. There was no simple answer. So they talked for hours, for days, for months, sometimes calmly, sometimes with frustration, but always with purpose. Outside those rooms, life moved slowly as it always had. Seasons changed, work continued, families grew. Most people were not part of these debates, but their lives would be shaped by them. Back inside, something important began to take form, not perfectly, but carefully. A system where power would not rest in one place. A system where decisions would be shared. A system designed not just for strength, but for balance. It was an idea both simple and complex. No single person should control everything, and no voice should be completely unheard. These ideas turned into writing, line by line, word by word. A document began to emerge, not just rules, but principles. It spoke about leadership, about rights, about responsibilities, about how decisions would be made and how power would be limited. But even then, not everyone agreed. Some worried it wasn't strong enough. Others worried it was too strong. So once again, there were discussions, adjustments, revisions, careful reconsideration. Because this wasn't just about the present, it was about creating something that could last, something that could grow, something that could adapt to a future no one could fully predict. And slowly, through patience and persistence, the foundation became clearer. A constitution, not perfect, but meaningful. A starting point. When it was finally accepted, there was no sudden transformation, no instant perfection, but there was something new, a shared agreement, a sense of direction. For the first time, this young nation had a structure to stand on. And yet, even with this new foundation, the story was far from complete. Because building a nation on paper is one thing, living it is another. Part 8. Moving West, Chasing Tomorrow. With a new nation slowly finding its shape, people began to look beyond what they already knew. To the west, there was land, vast, open, unfamiliar. It wasn't empty, but to many settlers, it felt like possibility. A place where life could begin again. A place where the future wasn't already decided. So they started moving. Not all at once, not in great waves at first, but steadily. Wagons rolled over rough ground, wooden wheels turning slowly, carrying families, tools, and everything they owned. The journey was long. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. There were no clear roads, only trails made by those who had passed before. Mornings came early, the air often cold, the ground uneven. People packed their belongings, checked their supplies, and moved forward, always forward. There were moments of quiet beauty, wide skies stretching endlessly above, sunsets that painted the land in soft colors, nights filled with stars brighter than anything seen before. In those moments, the journey felt almost peaceful. But it was never easy. Food could run low. Weather could change without warning. Illness could appear suddenly. Every mile required effort. Every step carried uncertainty. Still, they continued, because behind them was the life they had left, and ahead of them was something unknown, something hopeful. As they moved west, small settlements began to appear. At first, just a few homes, then a few more, a well, a field, a place to gather. Communities formed the same way they always had, slowly, through shared effort, through trust, through the simple act of living side by side. But this movement also brought challenges, because the land they were entering was already home to others, native tribes who had lived there for generations, who understood the land not as something to claim, but as something to live with. At times there were moments of cooperation, shared knowledge, quiet exchanges, a mutual understanding, brief but real. At other times there was tension, because two different ways of seeing the world were meeting again, and once again they did not always align. Still, the movement continued, because once people begin chasing a future, it's hard to stop. Back in the growing nation, things were changing too. The land was expanding, the map slowly stretching outward. With each new territory, new questions appeared. How should these places be governed? What rules should apply? How could unity be maintained across such distance? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they couldn't be ignored. And so, as people moved westward, the nation itself was also moving, not just across land, but through new challenges. The journey forward was no longer just about survival. It was about direction. Where was this nation going? What would it become? No one knew for certain. But one thing was clear. The story was getting bigger.
Part 9. A nation divided within. As the nation grew, so did its differences. At first, they were easy to overlook. Different regions had different ways of life, different priorities, different rhythms. In some places, life moved around farms and open land. In others, towns grew busier, filled with trade and industry. These differences were natural, expected even. But over time, they began to feel deeper. Conversations changed. What were once simple disagreements became harder to resolve. Not because people stopped talking, but because they began to see the future in very different ways. In quiet homes, around dinner tables, people spoke in careful voices about fairness, about work, about what the nation should stand for. There were no easy answers and no single agreement. The country, still young, was now facing something new, not a challenge from the outside, but from within. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, like a storm far in the distance, visible but not yet felt. Leaders met again, just as they had before, hoping to find solutions, hoping to keep things together. But this time, it was harder, because compromise requires common ground, and that ground was becoming harder to find. Outside of politics, life continued. People worked, children grew, seasons changed. But beneath those ordinary days, there was a quiet unease, a feeling that something wasn't right, that something couldn't continue as it was. And then, slowly, that distant storm began to arrive. Voices grew stronger, positions became firmer, the space between different beliefs widened. There were still those who hoped it could be resolved peacefully, who believed that time, patience, and understanding could bring unity back. And for a while, that hope remained. But not all divisions can stay quiet forever. At some point, they demand to be faced. And when that moment came, it did not feel like a sudden break, but like something that had been building for a long time, finally reaching its edge. A nation that had once come together now found itself pulling apart. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to change everything. There would be no easy path forward now, only a difficult one. And as the country stood at this turning point, there was one question no one could ignore. Could it remain united, or would it become something else entirely?
Part 10. When the silence broke again. For a long time, the tension had been quiet, felt but not fully seen, known but not fully faced. But there comes a moment when silence can no longer hold. It didn't begin everywhere at once, just in certain places, small signs that something had changed. Voices that were once careful became firm. Disagreements that were once private became public. People began to choose sides, not always loudly, not always openly, but clearly. In homes, conversations grew heavier. Friends found themselves thinking differently. Families sat in quiet disagreement. The question was no longer what is right, but whose side are you on? And once that question appears, things rarely stay the same. There were still hopes for peace, still efforts to hold things together, still voices asking for patience. But the space between those voices was growing. And then the silence broke. Not just in words, but in action. What had been tension became conflict. For many, it didn't feel like history in the making. It felt personal, immediate, real. Days that once felt ordinary now carried uncertainty. The future was no longer something to think about later. It had arrived. There were moments of stillness even then, early mornings where the world seemed unchanged, quiet evenings where life almost felt normal. But those moments didn't last, because the reality beneath them had shifted. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a test of unity, of belief, of whether a nation, still young, still forming, could survive its own divisions. People on all sides believed they were right, that they were protecting something important, something worth holding on to. And that made it harder, because when everyone believes they are right, finding peace becomes more difficult. Yet, even in conflict, there were quiet moments, moments of reflection, of doubt, of wondering how things had reached this point. Because not long ago, this was a nation just beginning, full of possibility, full of hope. And now, it stood in a very different place. But even in the middle of uncertainty, there was something that had not disappeared. A belief, quiet but still there, that somehow this would lead to something beyond the conflict. What that would be, no one yet knew.
Part 11. Healing, slowly. After the noise comes a different kind of silence, not the calm kind from before, but a quieter, heavier stillness. The conflict had changed everything, not all at once, but deeply. Homes had been affected, communities had shifted, lives had taken paths no one had expected. And when it was over, there was no clear moment where everything felt fixed. Instead, there was a beginning, a slow one. People returned to their daily lives, or tried to. Fields were worked again, shops reopened, families gathered, sometimes complete, sometimes not. There were empty spaces, places where someone used to be, moments where something felt missing. Healing doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't follow a schedule. For some, it began with acceptance, a quiet understanding that what had happened could not be undone. For others, it took longer, because letting go of pain is never simple. And yet, life continued, because it always does. Children grew up in this new reality, learning not just from books, but from the experiences of those around them. Stories were told, not always about victory or loss, but about what it felt like, what it meant. In time, something gentle began to return, not the same as before, but steady. Trust. Not fully, not immediately, but in small ways. Neighbors helping neighbors again, communities finding ways to rebuild, people choosing, little by little, to move forward. Leaders, too, faced their own challenges, how to rebuild not just structures, but unity. New decisions were made, carefully, with the understanding that the past could not be repeated. The nation was still there, changed but still standing. And perhaps that was the most important part, because survival is one thing, but continuing, learning, growing, that is something more. There was a quiet realization spreading through the country that strength doesn't come from avoiding difficulty, but from moving through it. And so, step by step, the nation began to heal. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. And as time moved forward, new challenges would come, new changes, new ideas, a new kind of world beginning to take shape. But for now, there was something simple and important. A chance to breathe again.
Part 3. Small Settlements, Big Dreams. The shoreline was no longer silent. Where there had once been only trees and wind, there were now small signs of human presence. Rough wooden homes, faint trails in the dirt, smoke rising gently into the sky. The settlements were still small, but they were growing. Each day began the same way, quietly. The first light of morning slipped through the trees. One by one, people stepped outside their homes, breathing in the cool air. There was always work waiting. Fields needed tending, tools needed repairing, food needed preparing. Life was simple, but never easy. The houses were modest, built by hand, piece by piece, wood gathered from nearby forests, walls shaped without perfection, roofs designed more for survival than comfort. Inside, there was little, but it was enough. A place to rest, a place to gather, a place to feel, even briefly, safe. Communities began to take shape. Neighbors became familiar faces. People learned each other's names, their habits, their struggles. There was no real privacy, not in the way we think of it today. Lives were shared. If someone needed help, others stepped in. If someone fell sick, the community noticed. In a world so uncertain, connection became strength. But even as these small communities grew, something else grew quietly alongside them. An idea. At first, it wasn't spoken loudly. It appeared in conversations, around dinner tables, during long walks, in quiet moments after a day's work. People began to think differently. They were far from the lands they came from, far from kings and governments that once controlled their lives. Here, things felt different, more open, more uncertain, but also more possible. What if they could make their own decisions? What if their lives didn't have to be directed by someone across an ocean? These weren't bold declarations, not yet, just thoughts, small but powerful. As more settlers arrived, the colonies expanded. Different regions began to develop their own identities. Some areas focused on farming, long days in the fields, tied closely to the rhythm of the seasons. Others became centers of trade, ships arriving and leaving, carrying goods, ideas, and stories from distant places. Despite the differences, there was a shared feeling. They were building something, not just homes, but a future. Still, life remained fragile. A poor harvest could change everything. A harsh winter could undo months of effort. Nothing was guaranteed. And perhaps that's what made each small success feel so meaningful. A full meal, a strong shelter, a peaceful night. There were moments of quiet joy, children playing near the edges of the forest, families gathering at the end of the day, laughter carried softly through the evening air. Simple things. But in a world like this, simple things mattered most. And yet beyond these daily routines, the world was slowly shifting. The connection to the distant ruling power still existed. Rules were still being made from far away. Decisions that affected lives here were often made by people who had never seen this land. At first it was accepted, then questioned,
then quietly resisted. The change didn't come at once. It rarely does. It started with thoughts, then conversations, then something more. Because as these settlements grew stronger, so did the belief that they could stand on their own. But belief alone isn't enough to change history. It needs a moment, a spark, something that turns quiet ideas into action. And that moment was getting closer.
Part 13. Through Uncertain Times. As the world grew faster, it also became more unpredictable. The energy of progress was still there, cities moving, ideas spreading, lives changing. But beneath it all, there was a quiet uncertainty. Not everything moved forward smoothly. Sometimes things slowed down, unexpectedly. There were moments when the rhythm of everyday life was interrupted. Work became harder to find. Plans became difficult to hold on to. The future, once full of direction, felt unclear. People noticed the change in small ways. Shops that once stayed open now closed early. Streets that once felt busy grew quieter. Conversations shifted from hope to concern. But even in uncertainty, life didn't stop. Mornings still came. People still woke up, even if they didn't know what the day would bring. Families adapted. They learned to do more with less, to support one another in ways that mattered. There was a quiet strength in that, not loud, not visible from a distance, but real. Communities became closer. Neighbors checked in on each other, shared what they could, offered help, not because they had extra, but because they understood the need. And in those moments, something important appeared. Resilience. The ability to continue even when things are uncertain. Not everything was solved quickly. Some days were harder than others. Some moments felt heavier than expected. But people kept moving forward, slowly, carefully. At the same time, beyond daily life, larger events were unfolding, events that connected this nation to the rest of the world. The idea that distance could protect a country was beginning to fade. What happened far away could now be felt at home. This brought a new kind of awareness, a realization that the world was more connected than ever before. And with that connection came new responsibilities, new challenges, but also new understanding. People began to see beyond their immediate surroundings, to recognize that their story was part of something larger. And even though uncertainty remained, there was also growth, a deeper awareness of what it means to endure, to adapt, to continue. Because uncertain times don't last forever, but what they teach often does. And as the nation moved through these moments, it was slowly preparing for what would come next, a new phase, a new challenge, a new chapter in a story that was still unfolding. Part 14. Standing Together in a Wider World. The world no longer felt distant. What once seemed far away now felt close. Events across oceans echoed at home. The nation had grown, stronger, faster, more connected. But now it faced something different. Not a challenge from within, but one that stretched across the world itself. At first, it was just news, stories carried through newspapers, radio, and quiet conversations. People listening, trying to understand what was happening beyond their borders. Then, slowly, those distant events began to matter more. Decisions had to be made, not just about the nation itself, but about its place in the world. Should it stay apart or step forward?
These questions weren't simple. They carried weight, because stepping into global events meant responsibility. It meant risk. And yet, there was also a sense of duty, a feeling that what happened elsewhere could not be ignored forever. As the nation became more involved, daily life began to shift again. People adjusted, not always dramatically, but noticeably. Work changed, priorities shifted, attention turned outward. There was a quiet seriousness in the air, not panic, not chaos, but awareness. Families gathered around radios, listening closely, voices from far away becoming part of everyday life. Even in these moments, there was calm, because people continued what they always had, living, adapting, moving forward. Communities stayed connected, supporting one another, sharing information, holding on to a sense of togetherness. And that togetherness mattered, because when a nation faces something larger than itself, unity becomes its quiet strength. Not everyone experienced this time in the same way. Some felt pride, some felt worry, most felt a mixture of both. But across all those feelings, there was something steady, a shared understanding that this moment was important, that the choices being made would shape not just the present, but the future. And as the nation stood within this wider world, it was no longer just growing for itself. It was becoming part of something bigger, a global story. And within that story, it would continue to change, to learn, to adapt. Because history doesn't stop at borders. It flows from one place to another, from one moment to the next. And now, this nation was fully part of that flow.
Part 15. The Modern World Begins. After everything that had come before, the nation stepped into something new. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, the world began to feel more familiar to us today. Homes changed. Cities expanded upward as well as outward. Lights stayed on longer into the night. Streets tarried a steady flow of movement. There was a sense that life had entered a new phase. Technology continued to grow, not just as tools, but as part of everyday living. Things that once felt extraordinary became normal. Communication became faster, easier, constant. Distance, once a barrier, now felt smaller than ever before. People could connect across miles as if they were in the same room. And with that connection, ideas moved quickly. New thoughts, new perspectives, new ways of seeing the world. The nation was no longer just developing, it was evolving. But even as everything sped up, something familiar remained. People still searched for meaning, still looked for stability, still wanted a sense of calm in a world that was becoming busier. Daily routines continued, morning routines, work schedules, evening quiet. Because no matter how advanced life becomes, it still moves one day at a time. There were also new challenges, different from the past, more complex in some ways. Questions about identity, about direction, about how to balance progress with purpose. These questions didn't always have clear answers, but they were important. Because a modern world doesn't just ask what can we do, it asks what should we do. And that question requires reflection. Even in a fast-moving world, there must be moments of pause, moments to think,
to understand, to choose carefully. The nation had come a long way, from quiet land and scattered tribes to a connected, modern society. But the story was not finished, because the present is always becoming the past, and the future is always just ahead. And so the journey continued, not as something distant, but as something happening now. Part 16. The quiet story continues. Even in a modern world filled with noise, speed, and constant motion, there are still quiet moments. Moments that feel almost unchanged from the past. A morning before everything begins, a pause in the middle of a busy day, an evening where the world slows down just enough to breathe. These moments are easy to overlook, but they matter, because history is not only made in big events, it lives in everyday life, in small decisions, in simple routines, in the way people choose to move forward. The nation, now vast and complex, is made up of millions of individual stories. Some are loud, seen, heard, remembered. Others are quiet, felt, lived, but rarely written down. And yet, both are part of the same story. A person going to work in the early morning, a family sharing a meal at night, a moment of reflection before sleep. These are not the events that fill history books, but they are the moments that shape life. And in many ways, they are what history truly is. Because behind every major change, there were ordinary days. Days where nothing seemed significant. Days where everything felt routine. But those days added up, step by step, year by year, creating something larger than anyone could see at the time. The present moment is no different. Right now, life continues. People are making choices, facing challenges, finding calm where they can. And without realizing it, they are shaping the future, just as those before them did. History doesn't announce itself as it happens. It unfolds quietly. Only later do we look back and see the meaning. So the story continues, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, in the rhythm of everyday life. And perhaps that is the calmest way to understand it, not as something far away, but as something we are all part of, a quiet, ongoing story. There is no true ending, only continuation. And somewhere, right now, the next chapter is already beginning. Part 17. The Digital Quiet. In today's world, the noise is different. It doesn't always come from streets or cities. It comes from screens. Small glowing windows that connect people across the world in seconds. Messages arrive instantly. News travels faster than ever. Voices, millions of them, speak all at once. And yet, within all that noise, there is still quiet. A person sitting alone, scrolling slowly. A pause before replying to a message. A moment where the screen goes dark and the room becomes still again. Technology has changed how people live, how they work, how they communicate, how they understand the world. But it hasn't changed something deeper. The need for calm. Even in a connected world, people still look for space. Space to think, to feel, to breathe without interruption. In the past, quiet came from distance, from forests, from open land, from places untouched. Now, quiet must often be chosen. Chosen in small ways, turning off notifications, stepping away from the constant flow, finding a moment that belongs only to you. Because the modern world doesn't slow down on its own. It keeps moving, always. And so, people learn something new: how to create calm within movement. This is a different kind of strength. Not just building or growing, but balancing. Knowing when to engage and when to step back. Knowing when to listen and when to be still. Across the nation, millions of lives unfold at once, each one different, each one carrying its own rhythm, some fast, some slow, but all connected in ways that would have been impossible before. And in that connection, there is both energy and quiet. Because even when everything feels immediate, there are still moments that feel timeless. A deep breath, a quiet thought, a pause between one action and the next. These moments don't appear in headlines. They aren't recorded in history books. But they matter, because they are where people find themselves again. And as the world continues to change faster than ever before, the story continues. Not just in what happens, but in how people respond, how they adapt, how they reflect, how they choose to live. And somewhere in between all the motion, the quiet remains. Waiting. Part 18. The future slowly arriving. The future doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself with a single moment or a clear beginning. Instead, it comes quietly, in small changes, in new habits, in things that feel unfamiliar until they slowly become normal. A new idea appears. At first, only a few notice. Then more people begin to see it, understand it, use it, and before long, it becomes part of everyday life. This is how the future has always arrived, not as something distant, but as something that slowly blends into the present. Across the nation, change continues. Technology grows more advanced. Cities become more connected. Voices become more diverse. There are more perspectives now than ever before. More ways to think, more ways to live, and with that comes both possibility and complexity. Because more choices also mean more questions. What direction should be taken? What should be preserved? What should be changed? These are not questions with quick answers. They require time, reflection, patience. And even in a fast-moving world, those things cannot be rushed. People continue to adapt, just as they always have, learning new skills, understanding new ideas, finding their place in a world that keeps evolving. Some changes feel exciting, full of promise. Others feel uncertain, even overwhelming at times. But this balance between excitement and uncertainty has always been part of progress. Looking back, every generation has faced it, in different ways, at different speeds. And now, this generation does the same. The future is no longer something far away. It's here, in the choices people make each day, in the way they connect with others, in how they respond to change. And yet, as everything moves forward, there is something steady beneath it all: the human experience. the need to understand, to belong, to find meaning. These things don't change. They carry through time, from the earliest days to now, and into whatever comes next. So the future continues to arrive, slowly, quietly, becoming part of the story before anyone fully realizes it. Part 19. The Calm Within the Noise. The world has never been louder, not just in sound, but in movement. Information flows constantly, voices overlap, moments compete for attention. Every second, something is happening, something new, something urgent, something asking to be noticed. And yet, within all of this, there is still calm. Not far away, not hidden, just quieter. It exists in small spaces, a deep breath before speaking, a pause between thoughts, a moment where nothing is demanded of you. These moments don't stop the world, but they change how it feels. Because calm isn't the absence of noise, it's the presence of stillness, even when noise surrounds you. Across the nation, life continues at many speeds. Some move quickly, chasing goals, building, creating. Others move more slowly, observing, reflecting, choosing carefully. And most people move somewhere in between, balancing, trying to keep up, while also trying to stay grounded. This balance isn't easy, because the world often encourages speed, faster decisions, faster reactions, faster movement. But calm asks for something different. It asks for space. Space to think, to understand, to respond, instead of react. And when people find that space, even briefly, something changes. Clarity appears. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to see things a little more clearly. And that clarity matters, because in a world full of noise, it's easy to lose direction, to move without intention, to follow without questioning. But calm brings you back to yourself, back to what matters. It doesn't remove challenges, it doesn't slow the world down, but it gives you a way to move through it, steadily. And so, even now, in the busiest, most connected time in history, the quiet story continues, not in the loudest moments, but in the calm within them.
Part 20. The Story That Never Ends. There is a quiet truth about history. It never really ends. It doesn't stop at a final chapter. It doesn't close like a finished book. Instead, it keeps going, softly, steadily, becoming part of the present while shaping what comes next. Everything that has come before, the land, the journeys, the struggles, the growth, none of it is separate from now. It all continues, in small ways, in the choices people make, in the paths they follow, in the way they treat one another. History is not just something we remember, it's something we live, every day. Right now, across the nation, millions of moments are unfolding. Some will be remembered, most will not, but all of them matter, because they become part of something larger, a story that no single person controls, a story shaped by time, by people, by quiet decisions made without knowing their full impact. And that is what makes it calm. There is no need to rush it, no need to force meaning into every moment, because meaning forms naturally over time, just as it always has. From the earliest days of quiet land
to the modern world of constant motion, the rhythm remains. Slow beneath the fast, quiet beneath the loud. And within that rhythm there is continuity, a steady thread connecting past, present, and future. So the story moves forward, not with a clear ending, but with an open path. And perhaps that is the most peaceful way to see it, not as something finished, but as something still becoming, still unfolding, still alive. And somewhere, in a quiet moment, the next part has already begun.
Part 21. The Echo of Time. If you listen closely, history doesn't just move forward. It echoes. Not loudly, not in a way that demands attention, but softly, through patterns. Things that have happened before find their way back again. Not exactly the same, but familiar. Moments of growth, moments of uncertainty, moments where people pause and wonder what comes next. These moments are not new. They have always been part of the story. Long ago, people stood at the edge of unknown land, unsure of what they would find. Later, they stood at the edge of new ideas, unsure of what they would become. And even now, people stand at the edge of the future, asking the same quiet question: where does this lead? The answer is never immediate, because time does not reveal everything at once. It unfolds slowly, allowing each generation to experience its own version of the journey, to feel its own challenges, to discover its own meaning. And yet, through all these changes, something remains constant: the human response, the way people adapt, the way they hope, the way they continue, even without certainty. This is the echo, not just of events, but of experience, a reminder that no matter how much the world changes, some things stay the same. The need to understand, the desire to belong, the search for calm in the middle of everything else. And perhaps that is what connects every part of this story, from the quiet land before names to the fast-moving present. A shared rhythm. Not perfect, not predictable, but real. And as this rhythm continues, so does the echo, carrying lessons forward, not as instructions, but as gentle reminders that every moment, even the smallest one, is part of something larger, something ongoing, something that never truly stops. Because time doesn't just pass, it speaks, quietly, through everything that has been and everything still to come.
Final part. A quiet ending. There is a gentle truth about every story. Even when it ends, it doesn't really feel like an ending. It feels like a pause, a moment to look back, to breathe, to understand. From the very beginning, when the land was silent and untouched, to the present, where the world moves faster than ever, so much has changed. And yet, something has remained the same. People, their hopes, their struggles, their quiet moments in between. History is often remembered through its loudest events, the moments that shaped nations, the decisions that changed direction. But beneath all of that, there has always been something softer: the everyday life. A sunrise at the start of a long journey, a quiet meal shared after a hard day, a moment of reflection when no one else is watching. These are the moments that don't make headlines, but they are the moments that make life. And when you step back and look at the full story, you begin to see it differently. Not as a series of events rushing forward, but as a steady flow, calm beneath the movement. A reminder that even in times of change, there is always something still, something grounded, something human. And maybe that's what this journey has always been about. Not just where we are going, but how we move through it. With patience, with awareness, with quiet understanding. Because in the end, history is not just the past. It is the present moment. It is this breath, this thought, this pause. And as this story comes to a close, it doesn't ask you to remember everything, only to notice something simple, that even now, in your own life, you are part of the story. Still moving, still becoming, quietly.